Right, today I want to talk about the first Passover, because sometimes it is good to go back to the beginning and examine what took place. So the Passover is the first of God's holy days. It begins in the first day of the month. And the word Passover is Strong 6453, Pesach. When you Google the pronunciation, you get about 2 or 3 different pronunciations. I had to use Google Translate to get Pesach. And it means to literally skip over, to omit, or to pass over. It's a literal translation. So the first Passover, the instructions for it is given in Exodus chapter 12, verses 3 to 14. So we will read about the instructions for the first Passover. Exodus 12. I'll be using the New Living Translation. And God is speaking to Aaron and Moses. You'll read that later when you do your own private study in verses 1 and 2. Announce to the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each family must choose a lamb or a young goat for a sacrifice, one animal for each household. If a family is too small to eat a whole animal, let them share with another family in the neighborhood. Divide the animal according to the size of each family and how much they can eat. So it was to ensure that everybody had adequate amount to eat, not like what was happening in the Corinthian church. Moving on, verse 5, the animal you select must be 1-year-old male. So we see specifics, either a sheep or a goat with no defects. Take special care of this chosen animal until the evening of the 14th day of this first month. So you have to guard this animal with all your life. No accident could happen from the 10th to the 14th. Then the whole assembly of the community of Israel must slaughter their lamb or young goat at twilight. More instructions. They are to take some of the blood and smear it on the sides and top of the door frames of the houses where they eat the animal. That same night they must roast the meat over a fire and eat it along with bitter salad greens and bread made without yeast, or unleavened bread as we know it. Do not eat any of the meat raw or boiled in water. The whole animal, including the head, legs, and internal organs, must be roasted over a fire. More instructions. Do not leave any of it until the next morning. Burn whatever is not eaten before morning. These are your instructions for eating this meal. Be fully dressed, wear your sandals, and carry a walking stick in your hand. Eat the meal with urgency, for this is the Lord's Passover. Continuing, verse 12. On that night, God speaking, I will pass through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn son and firstborn male animal in the land of Egypt. I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt, for I am the Lord. But the blood on your doorposts will serve as a sign marking the houses where you are staying. When I see the blood, I will, Pesach, pass over you. This plague of death will not touch you when I strike the land of Egypt. And verse 14, this is a day to remember. Each year from generation to generation, you must celebrate it as a special festival to the Lord. This is a law for all time, not sometime or when you feel like, all time. So what are some lessons we could learn from this keeping of the first Passover? I was reading this passage, chapter, and I realized that there are many lessons. Today I'll just focus on two. So the first lesson is this: total obedience to God's command resulted in his deliverance and protection. Total obedience to God's command resulted in his deliverance and protection. The first Passover was an exercise in faith and obedience to follow God's instructions. We just read the passage. Look at how many instructions God gave. And in those days, one can Google it or one can save it as a note on WhatsApp to just check. One had to commit it to memory. And God outlined specifics. He didn't leave any gray area. On the 10th day, they had to select the lamb or goat. It was 1 year old. It couldn't be 2. It couldn't be 3-year-old. It had to be without defect. I couldn't say, well, this one just has a mark on the back leg. I could use it. It had to be one without defect. There was no latitude in the specifications that God outlined. The only choice he gave here was a sheep or a goat. It was supposed to be slaughtered on the 14th at twilight. So one can say, well, I find that inconvenient to me. I prefer to slaughter it before everybody else, yes? Or why twilight? I like to observe this sunset. I want to slaughter it before so it wouldn't interrupt my sitting in the gallery and drinking coffee. And the blood was to be smeared on the doorposts, on the sides, and the lintel at the top. What if I just decided to smear it on the side? Instructions were also given. God gave instructions on how to eat it. The dress. One had to eat the meal as though one was getting ready to go on a journey. I could decide I wanted to eat it in casual clothes. Why must I have a staff in my hand getting ready? I wouldn't be able to enjoy this meal. Why must I eat it in haste? Fortunately, the Israelites didn't think like me, because I know from my experience I might, why obey every single thing? I'm speaking for me. So in Exodus chapter 12, verse 50, so all the people of Israel followed all the Lord commands to Moses and Aaron. They obeyed every single one that we just read in that entire chapter. On that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt like an army. Total obedience to all the commands resulted in them being spared from the final plague, from death. It resulted in their deliverance from bondage in Egypt. All. I had to smile because there were many instructions to follow. I remember in YOU, and this took place in 1984, we went to YOU Bible study in St. John's Road. I don't know if anybody can remember that, when the church had an office there. And Mr. Jailal had the YOU Bible study. And he brought this to Bible study one day, following in directions. And he shared it out. He said, you only have 5 minutes. It was longer. This is the only one I got to fit on my slide. He said, you have 5 minutes to do all. It was 25. First one, write your name at the top of the paper. And the second one was the direction I took was, before starting the assignment, read all the directions. But you know, me and many others, we just read about the number 9, and then you started doing it because time going. You said 5 minutes. So we stood there doing all sorts of craziness, turning around, jumping, clapping your hands, shouting your name. And there was one of my good friends sitting at the side of me, sitting doing nothing, watching me and smiling. I was wondering, why? Because he had followed the directions of Roderick Bargan. Luckily, thankfully, he is a surgeon now and not me, because he could follow directions. And he was sitting there, and the last instruction was, now that you have read all of it, simply write a name at the top. We felt like fools. I felt like a fool because I always try to summarize, do things quickly, and reading the first Passover and looking at all the instructions that God gave. You know, I wonder if I would have passed that test to follow every single detail that God gave. What are the implications for us today? Do we strive to obey all of God's commands? Or do we just obey those we feel are important and ignore those we feel that are not important? Sometimes we feel some commands are irrelevant. We feel so. God doesn't feel so. And we simply ignore it. What would have happened if we were there on that first Passover? Jesus Christ, speaking to his disciples, he tells them this in John chapter 14, verse 21. John 14, verse 21 tells us, those who accept my commandments and obey them are the ones who love me. Do I love God? We would all say yes. But do we obey all the commandments? Sometimes I can't say yes. But we have to strive to obey all if we love God, just as those who were in the first Passover had to obey every single command. Somebody can say, I'm too busy being a slave. I can't get a lamb or a goat on the 10th day. I'll get it tomorrow. Or I'll get it on the 14th. Why must I get it on the 10th? Luckily, they didn't think like that. Their lives were too important at that time. Second point, thankfully for you, is the last point. Observing the Passover is just the start of the journey. Passover was the beginning of the relationship, the first Passover, between the Israelites and the God of Israel. God was bringing them out of Egypt to take them to the promised land for them to be his special people. They needed to continue obeying God and trusting in him for this relationship to continue. Unfortunately, we know the story. That trust in God didn't last. 3 days later, in Exodus 15, 22 to 24, you could copy it. Complain, God brought us here to die. God just saved you from the slavery of Egypt. Drowned an entire army. But God brought you to the desert to die. Because of no water. It showed faith diminishing already. Because we humans are like that. And because the faith diminished, cry out and complain to God. In Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 to 3, copy it and check it later. 1 month later from leaving Egypt. Say, if only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. If only we were there, we had KFC and Royal Castle and Popeye's chicken. But here we are in the desert without meat. Complaining, lack of faith. This lack of faith culminated in Numbers chapter 14, verses 1 to 3. And all of us know the story here. When the spies were sent to spy out the promised land, and they brought back a report about the inhabitants of the land, and this is what happened in verse 1. Then the whole community began weeping aloud, and they cried all night. Their voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. God they were really protesting against. If only we had died in Egypt, or even here in the wilderness. Why is the Lord taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? So they had no faith, absolutely zero faith that God could be victorious with them in the promised land. So look at, this took place less than 2 years after leaving Egypt. Some scholars say 12 months, some said 13, some said 11, but I will say less than 2 years, just to be safe. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt? So from experiencing moving out of Egypt, going through the Red Sea, all the miracles God did, bringing water out of the rock, manna, the quail, to this point where they would cry all night and say God brought them here to die, sad. These are the people who went through the first Passover. And the next, later on in the chapter, verses 22 to 23, has some sobering scriptures. God speaking here. God is saying, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. And the sobering thought to my mind was the people who obeyed all those instructions, keeping the lamb on the 10th day, killing it at twilight, roasting it over the fire, eating it in haste. They obeyed God. Not one of them went to the promised land. Something for us to think about, except Caleb and Joshua. They didn't see the promised land because they lacked the faith. And the lesson for us is, taking the Passover does not mean we will see the promised land too. What does 1 Corinthians chapter 10 tell us? It gives us a warning. Verse 1, I don't want you to forget, dear brothers and sisters, about our ancestors in the wilderness long ago. All of them were guided by a cloud and moved ahead of them, and all of them walked through the sea on dry ground. So God was with them. And verse 11, these things happened to them as examples for us. They were written down to warn us who live at the end of the age. So all the people, 600,000 men, who took part in the first Passover, subtract 2 from that, you'll get 599,998 of them died before the promised land. Sobering thought for us. Even in the New Testament, we see somebody who took the Passover with Christ. Didn't make it. Judas. He was around the table with Christ, taking the Passover, sharing in the Passover. And we know what became of him. He didn't live beyond the next day. So as we close, the first Passover provides us with lessons to learn. One, total obedience to God, total, all, obey everything, results in deliverance and protection. Secondly, observing the Passover is just the start of the journey. What happens after observing the Passover will determine whether we make it to the promised land or end up like the other 599,998 men who didn't.